What if the strength of a nation is not measured by its weapons, not by its gold, but by whether a child eats a full meal tonight?
Right now, across Burkina Faso, something quiet is happening. No breaking news alerts, no dramatic headlines, just water. Still at first, then slowly moving again. Life returning to places that once felt forgotten. Let me ask you something. When was the last time you thought about where your food comes from? Because here, for many families, that question is not philosophical. It is survival. In a small village, a teacher named Daniel stands in front of his classroom. He watches his students closely. Not just their answers, but their energy. Some days, their eyes drift, their focus fades. Not because they don't care, but because hunger sits quietly beside them. In another part of the country, an older man named Issa walks toward a reservoir he once depended on years ago. He was a fisherman. Today, he pauses at the edge of the water, not sure what he will find. For a long time, these stories have been normal. Empty waters, empty nets, meals stretched thin. But now, something is beginning to change. Across this landlocked country, fish are returning to the water. Not by accident, not by chance, but through a deliberate effort to rebuild something many thought was already lost. And the impact is immediate. A meal with protein, a classroom with focus, a market with real trade again. It sounds simple, maybe too simple. So here is the question we need to ask. Can something as basic as fish really change the direction of a nation? Or is this just another moment of hope that will fade like so many before it? Stay with me, because what is happening here is not just about food. It may be about something much bigger, something most people are still not seeing. Across Burkina Faso today, the surface of the water is no longer still. Reservoirs that once reflected silence are now alive with movement. Small ripples spread across lakes and dams, not from wind, but from life returning beneath the surface. Fish, not imported, not delivered by trucks crossing borders. Raised here, grown here, caught here. This is not a campaign built for headlines. It is not a temporary relief effort designed to calm a crisis. It is something far more deliberate. A decision across the country. Local waters are being restored and used with a clear purpose. Farmers are learning how to manage fish stocks. Communities are building simple systems, nets, cages, ponds, not as experiments, but as part of everyday survival. There is no spectacle here, no grand ceremony, just work. In one region, small hatcheries quietly produce young fish, distributing them to nearby villages. In another, groups of women organize themselves around processing and selling what is now being caught locally. What used to arrive late, expensive, or not at all, is now present, available, reliable. In a town not far from Bobo-Dioulasso, Issa returns to the water again. This time, he does not stand and wait. He works. He throws his net with the kind of precision that only comes from memory, from years of doing something that once defined your life. When he pulls it back, there is weight, not symbolic weight, real weight, food. And in that moment, something shifts, not just for him, but for the entire idea of what is possible. Because for years, food here has depended on movement across borders. If trucks arrived, people ate. If they didn't, families adjusted. Quietly. Painfully. Now, that pattern is changing. Not everywhere. Not perfectly. But enough to be noticed. In a nearby village, a woman named Amina prepares a meal for her children. There is something different on the plate. Something that has not been consistent for a long time. Protein. Her children eat differently. Faster at first, then slower, as if they are relearning something their bodies had been missing. At school the next day, teachers begin to notice small changes. Attention lasts longer. Energy holds steady. These are not dramatic transformations. They are subtle. But they matter, because this is how stability begins, not with announcements, but with small, repeated improvements in daily life. And yet, outside observers might look at this and miss the point entirely. They might ask, why fish? Why not focus on something more valuable, more exportable, more visible? But that question reveals a deeper misunderstanding. This is not about global markets. It is about local control. Gold can be extracted and sold far away. Oil can be transported, negotiated, leveraged. But food stays. Food feeds. Food stabilizes. And that changes the equation in ways that are not immediately obvious. Because when a nation begins to produce what its people need to survive, it starts to reduce its dependence on decisions made elsewhere. And dependency, whether economic or political, always comes with conditions. For years, Burkina Faso has lived inside those conditions. Supply chains, prices, access, all influenced by forces beyond its borders. But when fish begins to fill local markets, something quiet begins to happen. Those conditions loosen, just a little at first, but enough to matter. Still, this is where the story becomes more complicated, because rebuilding something this fundamental is never just a technical challenge. It raises questions about sustainability, about scale, about whether this effort can continue under pressure, from climate, from conflict, from global forces that do not always favor independence. And maybe the most important question of all, if this model begins to work, if it continues to grow, what happens to the systems that once benefited from that dependency? Stay with me, because what we are seeing is not just a return of fish to the water. It may be the beginning of something that reaches far beyond it. As the first consistent harvests begin to appear across communities, the reaction is not what many outsiders would expect. There are no grand celebrations, no loud declarations of victory. Instead, there is something quieter, something deeper. Recognition in a market early in the morning, before the sun fully rises. Women gather around wooden tables. The air smells different now. Not just grain, not just dried goods. Fresh fish, laid out carefully, cleaned, prepared, ready. A woman reaches out, touches one, then another, as if confirming it is real. Not imported, not delayed, not dependent on a truck that may or may not arrive. Local. She buys it, wraps it, and walks home with something more than food. She carries certainty, and that is where the shift begins. Because hunger is not always loud. It does not always announce itself. It lives quietly in routines, in smaller portions, in skipped meals, in children who learn not to ask for more. So when that pressure begins to ease, even slightly, people feel it immediately. In one village, a group of men sit together after a long day. They speak less about politics, less about uncertainty, and more about practical things. How to improve their catch, how to store it, how to sell it. The conversation has changed from surviving to planning, and that is not a small change. That is a turning point. But not everyone sees it that way. Beyond the borders, in offices far removed from these daily realities, the reaction is different, measured, skeptical. Some analysts describe this effort as limited, vulnerable to drought, difficult to scale, too dependent on conditions that cannot be controlled. They ask whether this can truly last, whether it can grow, whether it can matter in a region facing complex security and economic challenges. And those questions are not unreasonable, because the Sahel is not an easy place to build anything, let alone something as sensitive as food systems. There are risks everywhere. Climate variability, security pressures, infrastructure limitations, all of it is real. But what these distant evaluations often miss is what is happening at ground level. Because this is not just a technical project, it is a psychological shift. For years,
Many communities have lived with the understanding, spoken or unspoken, that certain things must come from outside, food included. That mindset shapes behavior, expectations, even identity. But when people begin to see food produced locally again, consistently, something changes in how they think about their own capacity, their own control, their own future. And that kind of shift is difficult to measure, but powerful to witness. In a classroom, Daniel notices it again. The same students who once struggled to focus now stay engaged just a little longer. They raise their hands more often. They respond faster. It is not dramatic, but it is real. And it builds, day after day, meal after meal. Meanwhile, in the reservoirs, the work continues. Nets are repaired. Techniques are improved. Knowledge spreads from one village to another, not through formal systems, but through observation and experience. People watch what works. Then, they try it themselves. This is how systems grow organically, not through announcements, but through repetition. Still, beneath this growing sense of stability, there is a tension that cannot be ignored. Because when something begins to work, when dependency begins to decrease, it does not happen in isolation. There are always larger systems connected to that dependency. Supply chains, trade relationships, external influences. And when those systems begin to shift, even slightly, it raises a question that is rarely asked out loud. Who is affected when a country starts to rely less on outside support? Because change, even positive change, often creates discomfort somewhere else. And that discomfort does not always remain passive. So while the water moves, while the fish grow, while families begin to feel a quiet return of control, another layer of the story is beginning to take shape, one that goes beyond food, beyond local markets, beyond even national borders. So now we have to ask, is this simply a recovery, or is it the early stage of a much larger shift, one that others are already watching closely? Stay with me. Because what comes next may explain why something as simple as fish is starting to matter far more than anyone expected. When food begins to return quietly, steadily, it does more than fill plates. It changes behavior. In Burkina Faso today, something subtle is unfolding across villages and towns. It is not announced. It is not debated on television, but it is felt. Families begin to plan differently. Instead of asking, will food arrive? They begin to ask, how do we manage what we have? That difference may seem small, but it is the difference between uncertainty and control. Markets begin to stabilize. Prices fluctuate less. Traders adjust. Supply becomes something that can be anticipated, not feared. And with that comes something even more important: confidence. A farmer who knows food is available locally is more willing to invest time in other work. A mother who knows her children will eat is able to think beyond the next meal. A teacher who sees students improving begins to expect more from them. This is how stability grows, not through declarations, but through repetition, day after day, meal after meal. But there is another layer to this shift, one that is less visible, but far more significant. For years, dependency has shaped not just daily life, but national decisions. When a country relies heavily on external food supplies, it becomes vulnerable, not only to shortages, but to pressure. Economic pressure, political pressure, even strategic pressure. Because access to food is not just a humanitarian issue, it is leverage. And leverage, in the wrong hands, can shape outcomes far beyond the dinner table. Now, as Burkina Faso begins to reduce that dependency, even slightly, that leverage begins to weaken. Not disappear, but change. And that change has consequences, because systems built over decades do not adjust easily. Trade routes, agreements, pricing structures, regional dynamics, All of these are interconnected. When one piece shifts, others feel it. Quietly at first, then more clearly. For example, if local production increases, the need for imported supply decreases. That affects traders, distributors, and external partners who once played a central role in maintaining that flow. And when influence decreases, attention increases. Suddenly, what seemed like a small agricultural effort becomes something more noticeable, more scrutinized, because it is no longer just about feeding people. It is about control over one of the most fundamental aspects of national life. And control, once regained, is rarely given up easily. Inside communities, this shift is already visible. In one village, a group of young men who once considered leaving in search of work begin to reconsider. If food is stable, if small income is possible locally, staying becomes an option again. That alone has implications. Migration patterns change. Local economies strengthen. Communities hold together just a little more firmly. But stability is never guaranteed, especially in a region like the Sahel. There are still pressures that do not disappear simply because fish return to the water. Climate remains unpredictable. Water levels fluctuate. Security challenges continue to affect certain areas. And perhaps most importantly, growth brings visibility. And visibility brings attention. Because when something begins to work, people notice, not just within the country, but beyond it. And not all attention comes with support. Some comes with questions. Some comes with skepticism. And some comes with concern. Not necessarily about the success itself, but about what that success represents. Because if a nation can begin to feed itself more reliably, if it can reduce its dependence on external systems, if it can stabilize from within, then the balance of influence begins to shift. And that is where this story moves beyond agriculture entirely. Because this is no longer just about fish. It is about sovereignty. Practical, everyday sovereignty. The kind that does not appear in speeches, but shows up in kitchens, markets, and classrooms. And once people experience that, even in small ways, they begin to expect it, demand it, protect it. So now the question becomes sharper. This is no longer about whether fish can feed a nation. It is about what happens when a nation begins to rely on itself again, and whether that path will be allowed to continue without resistance. Stay with me, because when we step back and look at the bigger picture, this quiet transformation starts to connect to something much larger than Burkina Faso alone. From a distance, this story may seem small. A landlocked country, local fish production, rural communities rebuilding food systems. It doesn't look like geopolitics. It doesn't look like something that should matter to the rest of the world. But that assumption is exactly where many people get it wrong. Because for those who understand long-term stability, food is never just food. It is security. In regions like the Sahel, instability does not begin with headlines. It begins quietly, with shortages, with rising prices, with systems that fail under pressure. When people cannot feed their families, they move. First, within their communities, then across regions, then across borders. And over time, those movements ripple outward, toward North Africa, toward Europe, and eventually toward places like the United States. Not directly, but through the chain reactions that shape global stability. This is how local problems become international concerns. Not overnight, but steadily. So when a country like Burkina Faso begins to strengthen something as fundamental as food production, it is not just solving a local issue. It is reducing one of the root causes of instability. And that matters, because for decades, global strategies have often focused on reacting to crises, military interventions, emergency aid, temporary solutions. But those approaches rarely address the foundation: food, access, control. What we are seeing now is different. It is not reactive.
It is structural, and that is why it deserves attention. From a U.S. perspective, stability in the Sahel is not optional. It is connected to broader concerns: migration flows, regional security, the spread of extremist groups, and long-term geopolitical balance. When regions stabilize from within, the need for external intervention decreases. When they do not, the cost of instability increases. So the question is no longer whether this kind of effort is significant. The question is whether the world is paying attention early enough to understand what it represents. Because if something as simple as local food production can begin to shift stability in one part of the Sahel, then it raises a much larger possibility. What happens if this model spreads? Stay with me, because the answer to that question may shape far more than just one country's future. Right now, across Burkina Faso, the water is no longer silent. It moves. And beneath that movement, something deeper is taking shape. Not a headline, not a speech, but a shift. In small homes, meals are changing. In classrooms, attention is returning. In markets, trade is becoming local again. These are not dramatic transformations, but they are real. And real change rarely begins with something loud. It begins like this: quiet, steady, almost invisible to those who are not paying attention. But here is what makes this moment different. This is not just about solving hunger. It is about changing direction. For a long time, many nations have been told that development must come from outside, that solutions must be imported. But what happens when people start to see that something as simple as food can be produced, controlled, and sustained locally? That realization is powerful, because once people experience even a small level of independence, they begin to think differently. They begin to expect more, not just from their leaders, but from their future. And that is where this story becomes something much bigger than fish. Because the same principle can extend beyond food, into energy, into infrastructure, into security. And when that happens, the balance begins to shift, slowly, but unmistakably. Of course, this path is not guaranteed. There will be challenges ahead: climate pressures, security risks, economic realities that cannot be ignored. Nothing about this is easy, but something has already changed. The idea that dependence is permanent is no longer unquestioned. So now we are left with a question that reaches far beyond Burkina Faso. If a nation can begin to reshape its future, starting with something as basic as food, then what else is possible? And more importantly, who is ready for that kind of change? Because sometimes, the most important transformations do not begin with power. They begin with something much simpler: a net, a lake, a meal. And if you followed this story all the way through, then you already understand something many people are only beginning to see.